I was standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store in Tucson, Arizona, 8 months after my wife's body was pulled from Lake Tahoe, when I heard her laugh. Not a laugh that reminded me of her. Not one that made me think of her the way certain songs do, or the way the smell of coffee used to pull me back to Sunday mornings before everything fell apart. I heard her laugh, that specific, slightly too loud laugh she always made when she found something genuinely funny, the one that embarrassed our kids at restaurants when they were teenagers. The one I had not heard in 8 months. The one I thought I would never hear again. I did not move. I just stood there holding a box of oatmeal, listening. She was 2 aisles over. I could hear her talking to someone, a low murmur I couldn't make out, and then the laugh again. I put the oatmeal back on the shelf very carefully, the way you move when you think any sudden sound might shatter something. Then I walked to the end of the aisle and looked around the corner. She had cut her hair. It was shorter now, just below her ears, and she was wearing clothes I didn't recognize, a green linen shirt, white pants, sandals. She was pushing a cart and talking to a man who looked about my age, maybe a few years younger, with a gray beard and a relaxed posture. The posture of someone who lived somewhere warm and had nowhere urgent to be. She reached up and touched his arm while she laughed again, and I watched her left hand, the one with the 2 small scars just below the knuckle on her ring finger, the one she got when she was 9 years old and put her hand through a glass storm door at her grandmother's house in Tennessee. The scars were still there. I walked out of the store without my groceries and sat down on a concrete parking barrier and tried to breathe. Her name was Carol. We had been married for 31 years. On a Friday evening in late November, she had gone sailing with a group of friends on Lake Tahoe, a farewell trip, they said, for a colleague who was relocating to Seattle. I had stayed home because I had a bad knee, and cold water had never been my idea of fun. The sheriff's department called me at 11:15 that night. There had been an accident. The boat had taken on water near the North Shore. Everyone made it back except Carol. They found her life jacket floating near some rocks. They searched for 4 days. They found her body on the 5th day, tangled in debris near a submerged dock. I identified her through personal effects, her watch, her wedding ring, the small anchor tattoo on her right ankle that she had gotten on our 20th anniversary, and immediately regretted. The face was damaged from the water. I was told that was normal. I believed it because I was a 64-year-old man who had just lost his wife, and I did not have the capacity to disbelieve anything. I signed the paperwork. I buried her. I went back to our house in Sacramento, and I sat in the dark for about 3 weeks, and then I tried to figure out how to be a person again. I was in Tucson because my younger brother lived there. He had been calling me every few weeks since the funeral, the kind of calls where neither of us said much, but both of us needed to hear the other's voice. He finally told me to come down for a few days, get out of Sacramento, stop eating cereal for dinner. He did not know I was in that grocery store. I had slipped out early in the morning while he was still asleep because I couldn't sleep past 5 anymore, and I didn't want to wake him. I sat on that parking barrier for a long time. The logical part of my brain, the part that had spent 32 years as a civil engineer, the part that dealt in load-bearing calculations and structural tolerances, kept presenting me with the obvious explanations. Grief does things to people. I had read about it. The mind reaches for the familiar. I had probably seen a woman who resembled my wife, and the laugh had done the rest. It happened to people. It was happening to me. But the scars, I had held that hand 10,000 times. I knew those scars the way I knew the layout of my own house in the dark. They were not something you misremember or project onto a stranger. I went back inside. I found her in the produce section. I stayed far enough back that she wouldn't notice me, close enough to see her clearly. I watched her for 20 minutes. She moved the way my wife moved, that slight forward lean when she was reading something, the way she always squeezed avocados, even when she had no intention of buying them, the habit of pushing her hair behind her right ear even though it was now too short to stay there. The man with her was comfortable around her. Not new relationship comfortable. Long relationship comfortable. He knew where she was going to turn before she turned. He reached past her for something on a shelf without asking. She handed him items without looking. They had a system. They checked out, and I followed them to the parking lot and watched them load groceries into a silver SUV with Arizona plates. I memorized the plate number. I wrote it on my hand with a pen I found in my jacket pocket. Then I watched them pull out of the lot and drive west. I went back to my brother's house, and I sat at his kitchen table, and I wrote the plate number on a piece of paper, and I stared at it. My brother found me there when he came downstairs. He asked me what was wrong. I told him I thought I'd seen someone I recognized and I wasn't sure. He poured us both coffee and sat across from me and waited, because that's the kind of man he is. I didn't tell him who I thought I'd seen. Not yet. I needed to be wrong first, and then I needed to figure out how I was wrong, and then I could explain it to someone else. I spent the rest of that day trying to be wrong. I drove the route they had taken until I found the neighborhood. It wasn't hard. Tucson is a city, but it's not a big city, and the direction they had driven narrowed things down considerably. I turned down a street lined with saguaros and adobe walls, and I drove slowly until I saw the silver SUV parked in a driveway. The house was a single-story ranch style, terracotta-colored, with a covered porch and a large agave plant near the front door. It looked like a house where someone had lived for years, not a rental, someone's home. I drove past and parked 2 blocks away and thought about what I was doing. What I was doing was either the most rational thing I had ever done in my life or a symptom of grief so severe that I needed professional help immediately. I was genuinely unsure which. I went home back to my brother's house and I called a man I had worked with years ago who had left engineering to become a private investigator. We had stayed in loose touch the way you do with people you genuinely like but don't have much reason to call. His name was Raymond. I told him I had a plate number and I needed to know whose name was on the registration. I told him I would explain everything later and that I knew how it sounded. He called me back that evening. The SUV was registered to a man named Douglas. He lived at the address I had found. He was 61 years old, retired, had lived in Tucson for approximately 9 years. 9 years. I asked Raymond if there was a woman at that address. He said the property records showed a single owner. No spouse on file. I told him to keep looking. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my brother's guest room and I went back through 31 years of marriage looking for the things I had missed or chosen not to see. Because that is what you do at 3 in the morning when you are wondering if your dead wife is alive and living in Tucson with another man. You audit everything. And there were things. When I looked at them honestly, there were things. She had traveled for work 4 or 5 times a year for the last decade. She was a healthcare consultant. It made sense. It had always made sense. She had a separate cell phone for work, had for years, some arrangement with her employer about privacy and billing that I had never questioned because I was not a suspicious man and she was not someone I had reason to suspect. There had been a period around 8 years ago when something was off between us, a distance I couldn't name, a flatness in her that I had attributed to stress and eventually to just the way long marriages settle, and then it had passed and I had been relieved and moved on. 8 years ago. The year before, she apparently met Douglas. Raymond called me 2 days later. He had dug further. The woman living intermittently at the Tucson address, neighbors had mentioned a woman, though she wasn't always there, matched a description consistent with someone using a name I didn't recognize. But one neighbor, an older woman who walked her dog every morning, had mentioned that Doug's girlfriend had a scar on her left hand and a laugh you could hear from across the street. I drove back to Sacramento. I needed to look at the paperwork. I had kept everything from the death certificate, the autopsy summary, the documentation from the funeral home, the insurance claims. I had kept it all in a folder in my filing cabinet because I didn't know what else to do with it, and I hadn't been able to throw it away. I pulled it out and I read it the way I should have read it the first time, which is to say carefully, without the fog of shock and grief and 3 days without sleep. The body identification. I had not been the one to identify the body. I had been told, gently, by the lead detective handling the case, that the body had been in the water for 5 days and that the physical condition was such that visual identification would be distressing and inconclusive. He had suggested, and I had agreed, because of course I had agreed, because I was not thinking clearly, and he was a professional, that identification be handled through personal effects and through a separate confirmation by someone familiar with the deceased. That confirmation had been provided by my wife's closest friend, a woman named Patrice, who had been on the boat that night. Patrice had identified the body. Patrice, who had been on the boat. Patrice, who had called me the night of the accident, crying so hard she could barely speak, who had sat in the front row at the funeral, who had hugged me and told me that my wife was the most remarkable woman she had ever known. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time. Then I called Raymond and told him everything. It took Raymond 3 weeks to build a clear enough picture. I won't recount every step because some of it is still part of the legal record and some of it I am still not entirely at peace with. But here is what he found. My wife had met Douglas at a conference in Phoenix 7 years ago. She had been traveling to Tucson 3 or 4 times a year since then, telling me she was working with clients in the Southwest. She had, over the course of 7 years, quietly shifted a significant portion of our shared assets, retirement accounts, a brokerage account I rarely checked, proceeds from a rental property we owned, into accounts I did not have access to. She had done it slowly, in amounts that didn't trigger the reviews that larger transfers would have. I was not a man who monitored finances closely. She had known that. The woman they pulled from Lake Tahoe was not my wife. Her name, her real name, was Margaret. She was 62 years old, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer 18 months before the accident, had been given perhaps 6 months to live. She had a daughter she was estranged from, no close family, significant debt. Raymond found evidence financial transfers I will not detail here suggesting she had been compensated, or rather, that her debts had been cleared and a sum had been directed somewhere she had specified, likely for the daughter she no longer spoke to. Whether Margaret fully understood what she was agreeing to, whether she knew she would not be coming back from that boat in November, I cannot say with certainty. I hope she understood. I hope she made a choice. I have thought about Margaret more than almost anything else in this entire story. Patrice had been the one to manage the identification. Patrice had known. Patrice had been, it turned out, the one to introduce my wife to Douglas in the first place. Years before they had grown up in the same city in Ohio and had found each other again at a conference, and the introduction had been casual and friendly and had set everything else in motion. I learned all of this over 3 weeks in January, sitting at the same kitchen table where my wife and I had eaten breakfast for 23 years. My son, we have 2 children, a son who lives in Portland and a daughter who lives in Chicago, did not know. I am certain of that, and I was certain of it before I confirmed it. Because I know my son, and I know his face, and if he had known, I would have seen it in the 8 months he had spent trying to take care of me after the funeral. He had flown down twice from Portland. He had called every Sunday. He had been carrying his own grief this whole time, the grief of losing his mother, and that made what I had to tell him both necessary and almost unbearable. I told him on a Sunday night in late January. I called him on video so I could see his face. I told him to sit down, and I told him all of it. Everything I knew, as clearly as I could. He didn't say anything for a long time after I finished. Then he asked me one question. Is she safe? I understood what he meant. He meant, was she physically safe? Was she alive? Was she somewhere that wasn't dangerous? Even after everything, that was his first question. Because she was his mother. I told him yes. I told him yes, and I told him that what came next was not going to be easy. Raymond had connected me with a retired federal investigator who had handled financial fraud cases. She reviewed everything he had compiled. She told me I had a strong case, and that the involvement of the Lake Tahoe incident, the staging of a death, the use of a deceased woman's identity, the insurance fraud elevated this from civil to federal criminal territory. She made some calls. 3 weeks after that conversation, the FBI opened a formal investigation. I want to be careful about how I describe what followed because some of it is still in the courts. But I will say this. My wife was located in Tucson. She was taken into custody on a Tuesday morning in March, in the driveway of a terracotta-colored house with a saguaro in the yard. Douglas, as far as I understand it, had not known about the staged death or the identity of the woman in the lake. He had known she was married. He had believed, apparently, that she was in the process of leaving me, that the relationship was complicated, that things would resolve themselves eventually. I do not know whether to believe that. I have chosen not to think about it too hard. Patrice was arrested 2 days later. The charges were extensive. I will not list them all because this is not a legal brief and I am not a lawyer. What I will say is that the insurance payout, a life insurance policy I had not even thought about in the fog of grief that had paid out in January, 4 months after the accident, while I was still sitting in my dark house in Sacramento eating cereal for dinner, was substantial. The financial investigation uncovered 3 years of methodical asset transfers. The total, when it was all finally counted, was a number I still sometimes write on paper and stare at just to confirm it is real. My daughter flew in from Chicago when I told her. She sat across from me at that same kitchen table and cried in a way I had not seen since she was a small child. The kind of crying that is also rage, that shakes the whole body. She kept saying she was sorry, as though she had done something wrong, as though she owed me an apology for not having seen it. I told her there was nothing to see. I told her I had lived with this woman for 31 years and I had not seen it either. That is not a comfort exactly. It is just the truth. The hardest part, the part I still carry differently from all the rest, is the grief, not the anger, not the financial loss, though that was real and serious and took months of legal work to begin to address. The grief, because I grieved this woman for 8 months. I cried at her grave. I kept her coffee mug on the counter because I couldn't make myself put it away. I went to sleep and I woke up and I missed her, a physical thing, like a stone in the chest. I missed a person who was not dead and who had made a deliberate choice to let me believe she was, who had watched me, from wherever she was, grieve her and not felt enough of anything to stop it. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not sure I ever will. There is a counselor I see on Thursday afternoons in Sacramento. She is patient, and she does not rush me through things. She told me once that grief and betrayal are not opposites, that you can hold both, that the loss was real even if the death was not, because what I lost was not just a person but a version of reality I had believed in completely. I thought that was a generous way to look at it. I'm still working on believing it. My son got married last fall. It was a small ceremony, outdoors, in the kind of golden October light that makes everything look like it belongs on a painting. I walked through it the way I have walked through most things in the past 2 years, present, functioning, but aware at every moment of the strange shape my life had become. His wife is kind and funny, and she made him a playlist for the reception that started with a Stevie Wonder song I happen to love. And for a few minutes during that first dance, I felt something close to ordinary happiness, which is the closest I get these days, and which I am learning to receive without comparing it to what I thought I had before. I sold the house in Sacramento. I am living in a smaller place now, closer to my brother, in a city where I do not have 31 years of morning light on the same kitchen table. That sounds like loss, and in some ways it is. In other ways, it is the lightest I have felt in years. I have stopped keeping her coffee mug on the counter. There is a woman I have coffee with, sometimes a neighbor, a retired school principal with a dog that has strong opinions about everyone it meets. We walk sometimes in the evenings and we talk about books and local politics and our adult children and occasionally about the parts of our lives that did not go the way we planned. We are not in a hurry about anything. At 64, not being in a hurry feels like something I earned. The case is still moving through the courts. I have been told not to expect anything fast, and I have taken that to heart, because expecting things fast is how I spent most of my adult life, and it did not serve me especially well in the end. I show up when they need me to show up. I answer the questions I am asked. I have a good attorney, and I trust the process, which is something I would not have said I was capable of 2 years ago. I think about Margaret sometimes, the woman in the lake. I looked into what I could find about her, her daughter's name, where she grew up, what kind of life she had before she got sick. I sent the daughter a letter, once. I did not explain everything, because not all of it was mine to explain. I just told her that I had known something about her mother's last year, and that I wanted her to know her mother had been thought of, that she had not been invisible to the people whose lives she had passed through. The daughter wrote back. It was a short letter. She said, "Thank you." That is the letter I keep in my filing cabinet now, in place of all the paperwork I eventually had to hand over to investigators. I have been asked, by my son, by my brother, by the counselor on Thursday afternoons, whether I am angry. It is a fair question, and I think about it honestly. Yes, there is anger there. It is not the loudest thing, but it is there, a steady low current under everything else, the kind you don't feel constantly but that is always running. I am angry at the years. I am angry at the careful, systematic way it was done, the patience it required, the deliberateness. I am angry that she looked at our life, at our house, and our children, and our 31 years, and calculated what it was worth to her, and found a number. But mostly what I feel, on the ordinary evenings when the neighbor's dog has decided I am acceptable and we are walking in the late afternoon desert light, is something harder to name, a kind of stunned gratitude maybe, that I am here, that I heard a laugh in a grocery store in Tucson when I was supposed to be buying cereal, that whatever instinct made me stop and listen. Instead of walking away and telling myself I was imagining things, that instinct was right. I built bridges for 32 years. I know something about the weight a structure has to carry, and about the difference between a foundation that will hold and one that only looks like it will. I thought I knew which one I was living on. I know more now. It is not a comfortable kind of knowing, but it is mine, and I am not letting go of it. If there is anything I would say to someone sitting where I was sitting 2 years ago in the dark, eating cereal, trying to figure out how to still be a person, it would be this. The thing that looks like the end of everything is sometimes just the end of one version of things. You cannot see that from inside it. I could not see it. But it is true. And at some point, usually when you are not looking for it, you find yourself standing in the October light at your son's wedding, and a song you love comes on, and for a few minutes you are simply there, simply present, simply alive. That is enough. On most days, that is genuinely enough.